Alright, in this video I'm going to look at material basics. It's probably one of my favorite aspects of 3D is actually creating materials. Second will be lighting, but I really enjoy creating materials. What I'm going to start out with here is the Scanline renderer. And I'm going to start out with that because I just want to begin here and look at some of the Scanline material options before switching over to Mental Ray. By default, the first material that you'll come across is the standard material. And what we have here, if you look at this, you have it broken down into several sections. You have the shader basic parameters, and then as you can see, this is set up as a blend material, and then you have the blend basic parameters. If I come in and I change this to something like Phong, then I have the Phong basic parameters, which are kind of similar to the blend options. I'm not sure if you can see the difference here in this shader ball. Let me expand that. To make that larger, what you can do is just double click on that and it'll launch this smaller independent browser for the materials. So what I can do is switch this back to blend, and you can kind of see the change in the shading, the mathematics, I guess you could say, going on between the highlights here, the shading parameters. You can switch it to a metal material, multi-layer. This is all under the standard material. It's just basic shader types of a standard material. And what this is really affecting mostly is the way the highlights work on this particular material. So what I'll do is start off with, let's look at the blend material, since that's the standard or the default option that it goes to here. And what you would do, you have a diffuse, a specular, self-illumination option, opacity, and then you can tune the specular highlights option. For diffuse color, this is where you would assign a texture map, like the color of a texture. Say if you wanted to assign a brick wall, have this like a brick wall, what you would do is come in and select, say, bitmap, and you could come through and go find your textures. And if you wanted, let me just pull over here, maybe if I wanted this to be a wood material, I could select the wood material. Generally, it's a good idea to decrease that blur to get a nice sharp texture, especially when using these bitmaps. I always decrease that down to the lowest value. It comes in at a blur value of 1, and you can probably see that effect here in this material later. Once I decrease that, you can see how you get a little more detail out of that. And you can't go to 0. The lowest you can go is 0.01. To get there quickly, what I do is right click on the spinner with my mouse. I just right click and it takes it to the lowest value for that particular spinner. Okay, so now I have assigned this texture map. Now if you wanted to see that in the viewport, what you can do is enable this show standard map in viewport, and that's going to show this whole material setting here. If I wanted to just show the bitmap, I could come in and click it on that sub-level where I've assigned this bitmap. You can see how that's taken away. That's not highlighted anymore. So what that means is if I increase the specular here, you can see how that's going to increase, but you can do that either way. Sometimes if you assign something like a shader in between here, it may prevent it from showing if you do this high level show standard map in viewport. So just remember, if you run into that problem where it doesn't show, you may actually have to go into the bitmap level and show it there. And to go switch between levels, as you can see, I'm clicking this go back to parent mode. So once I go in, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Once I go into a level, say if I wanted to edit this bitmap, I would just left mouse click, and then once I'm here and I can change whatever settings. If I wanted to tile that further, I could do that. And then once I'm done, I just go back up one level, back to the main parameters here. Again, for specular highlights, which would be, think of these specular highlights as fake reflections, because that's basically what's going on. A specular is really a reflection of something, more a light source or a bright object, something like that. So you can change the specular color here if you wanted to. You could have assign a certain color for the specular if need be. You could assign a map here if you wanted to break up the specular. You could come in and assign any of these maps, these sub-maps. You won't have the V-Ray ones here listed unless you've installed V-Ray, so just ignore those. But if, for example, I wanted to apply a noise map here to the specular option, what I can do is decrease that size because 25 is quite large. You can't really see the effect. If I decrease it, maybe not that small, something like so. And if I wanted to see this in the viewport, I can go back to that show standard map in viewport, and there's my noise only map. So now I can adjust that down, something like so. Maybe I want it to be fractal. Maybe decrease that further, like that. And so you can see how that's breaking up that specular pattern, or that specular highlight. Now you can also, along with the specular color, you're breaking that up. You could also do the same thing for the actual specular level. If I wanted to, I could either copy this over or swap it. Right now I'm just going to swap this. And so what that's doing is actually breaking up that level of specular. So for example, some of the textures that you may purchase will come with like a diffuse texture, a specular, or glossiness texture, and a bump map. Those are probably the most common textures that you would get. You would plug your diffuse texture or color texture into the diffuse slot here, and the specular, you can control that either with the specular level. So you'd plug that map into here, or in the specular color slot, or both. And then of course if you had a bump map, you would have to scroll down. Let me just close up. I have a Maxwell parameters. Again, if you haven't installed Maxwell, you won't see this rollout. But if you had a bump map, you could come down to the standard material, this maps rollout, and you can see that there's more maps in here that you can find, that you can use. And down here at the bottom you'll see that there's a bump map option. So what I'll do is, let's assign a bitmap here, and we can just use the ones that I'm using here as an example. These are arrowway textures, so you can see that with these you get a diffuse color, a bump map, and a specular map for this particular material. So what I'll do is plug this bump map in, and you can see it tells you the values that you want to use. Like this one would be a value of 30, which is the default value for the bump. So let me just grab that. Again, I'm going to decrease the blur value, bring that out, and you can see what that's going to do here. Go back up to my main level, and in the specular level, instead of using that noise map, let's go ahead and cut that out. And what I could do is assign a that other bitmap here. Here we have the S, which means specular for this particular map. Now if I give this a render, you'll see what this is supposed to look like. And one thing, I'm just going to let this actually render because I want you to see render speed here as a consideration for using Mental Ray or using the Scanline renderer. You'll find that generally speaking, the Mental Ray renderer is a little bit faster, or actually it could be quite a bit faster, especially for scenes like this. And to show you that, what I'll do is, we had a render time here of 21 seconds. So what I'll do is switch over to Mental Ray, and to do that I'm just going to go to the Common tab of my render settings here and expand the Assign Renderer button, and I'm going to come down and I'm going to pick the Mental Ray renderer and click OK. Now to make this comparison fair, I'm just going to come in and cut off indirect illumination because I don't need to calculate that. It's just going to slow down the render a little bit, and I wasn't calculating any indirect illumination in the Scanline renderer. Now the quality here is fairly high in the Scanline renderer. It looks pretty good. I'm just going to leave the settings here by default and see how close it matches. But if I give this a render, remember we had a render time of 21 seconds. If I click render again, You can see that went through at 4 seconds. So it's a little bit blurrier. There's not as much detail. So what I could do is increase the image precision to kind of make it a more apples to apples comparison, if you will. Render that again. Again, you can see now I have more detail here. Render time is only 7 seconds instead of 21. If I wanted to go further and give more detail to this, I could do so by maybe switching over to like a land coast filter instead of a box filter, and that's just going to sharpen this up a little bit more. So I consider that a fairly high setting for mental ray, and as you can see, it's still chugging away at 9 seconds versus 21 seconds for this particular material. So you know, keep that in mind. You'll probably hear some people say, well, mental ray slow, or they just complex or something along those lines, and really that's just not the case. It can be extremely fast, and a lot faster than the Scanline renderer on especially things like this particular material, which has the fake highlights, the fake specular maps. It can be extremely fast. Now, getting back to terms of materials here, as I said, the first one that you'll see here is the standard material. If you click that button, you'll bring up the material map browser. And you can see there's a lot of materials listed here. What I'm going to do is just switch back to this here. And there's nothing in this scene to reflect. Well, I do have a couple of light cards here. I'll take that back. Let me just go to my perspective view and switch around here. Yeah, okay. I've got a couple of light cards here. And a light card is just an object that has a self-illuminated material on it. If I want to see what this material is, what I can do is grab this eyedropper, and it'll let me pick the material and reload it into the material editor here. And all it is a standard material with self-illumination. And what I've done is I've applied a map here, an output map, and I've had to boost that output value just so I can make it a lot brighter here, because what I wanted to do is show some reflections here later on in the discussion. So the environment is black, and all you'll see reflecting are these white cards here. Okay, let me close the material editor for a minute. If I scroll around, you'll see, and back up here a little bit, you can see that there's two of them, and they're placed right where the lights are. So for now, since I'm not using a reflective material, I'm going to hide those, and to do that I've got those on a separate layer. So I'll just open up my layer manager, and here I'm selecting these white cards, which they're under this particular layer, and I'll just hide those for now. Hit C to go back to my camera view. And what I want to show you is when I mentioned earlier about a fake highlight or specular reflection, what I want to look at is just that. I'm going to increase the specular on this material, and you can see that happening in the viewport there. It's not really a true reflection, because if I render this, I just wait for this to render, as you can see, it's not reflecting, this material is not reflecting this yellow object here. It's still kind of its own non-reflective material, but it has these highlights now from the light sources. And to show you again this, if I go into the light settings here, and I come down to the advanced effects options, and I turn off specular, and do the same thing for this light, disable specular, you can see that happening here in the viewport. If I render this again, so as you can see and would expect, there's no specular highlight here. The point of showing you that is when you use these materials, these, I call them fake materials if you will, they are very fast to render, especially for simulating really diffused glossy materials. Just keep in mind that you will have to place these highlights using light sources with specular options, because it will not reflect an object in your scene. So in order to get that specular highlight, you have to have a light source that has this specular option. And again, it's good for diffused reflection or a diffuse specular. If I go up to a sharp specular here. Let me just increase this. You can get a sharp specular highlight on this as well. But really, if you had something like that, it would be you'd want more so of a reflective surface, because it doesn't look. You'd think this would be really shiny with that real small specular highlight. It just looks kind of glossy, but yet you don't see any reflections in it. So in order to get that, if you're using the Scanline renderer, what you can do is use a ray trace material. So that it will, as it sounds, actually start tracing some rays around. So what I'll do is, again, I'm just clicking on this material button here. I'm going to switch this material to a ray trace, or load a ray trace material. And I'm going to turn on this option here for background. And what that does is just gives you a background here, something to reflect when you're setting up your materials. Now, in order to make this reflective, what I can do is come in and increase that reflect value here, which is black by default or off. If you turn that to white, it's 100% reflective. As you can see here, it's pretty much like a chrome material. Now, if I apply this to the little test object here and render that, one thing you'll notice is that it'll take a little bit longer to render because you're calculating these ray trace reflections. You can still see a specular highlight, and you can see a reflection here. It's not. It's kind of hard to make out just because of the angle that I'm at, but you can see the reflections going on here in this particular material. Now, to help bring those reflections out, and by the way, that's another. Before I talk about something else, if you notice, this doesn't look like this. The reason is, here you have an environment, this checker pattern with all these colors on it, so that object is reflecting that. Right here in my scene, the reason it doesn't look like this is because there's nothing to reflect. It's a black environment. So all you're picking up is the black reflected environment and these white, these specular highlights. And in here you're picking up some reflections off of the material itself, the reflection of this yellow object. So that's the reason the render does not actually look like this. Now, if I were to unhide the those white cards, I just click that to bring those back and give this a render. Now you can see that we're picking up those reflected white cards here. Okay, so if you keep in mind, if you need actual reflections, you may want to use this ray trace material over the standard material, because the standard material doesn't have the ray trace reflections. However, you can add ray trace reflections to the standard material, and to do that, which really you probably just want to use the ray trace, but if you wanted to add ray trace capabilities to the standard material, you can do that with by applying a map here to the standard material. In the reflection slot here, you can come down and put a ray trace map, and now, as you can see, when I go back here, it's actually reflecting now. Probably a better way to do that is to put that inside of a fall-off map, but I'll get into that those type of maps a little bit later. But as you can see, we're reflecting here, and it's an additive type reflection, because it's, as you can see, this has some of the diffuse, that gray color, added to this reflection or this material. If I didn't want that, if I wanted it to look more like this ray trace, I could come in and turn that color down a little bit. And if I just apply this to the little test object here, you see it looks almost identical to the ray trace map that I just rendered out a while ago. Of course, the difference is you don't see those specular highlights. That's because I have the glossiness value here set to 100. If I decrease that down something like so, now we should be similar to the ray trace material. Maybe set this to black. Okay, so that provides both the actual reflection now and this specular highlight. what I'll do is just reset this by loading another standard material in. Close that render. And I just want to go over the maps here again. What we have, you can have an ambient color. So you can have this ambient color, and what that's going to do is provide kind of an ambient illumination to this particular material. Now, right now, the ambient is locked with the diffuse color. So in order, if I wanted to use that separately, I'd have to unlock it, and to do that, you have this little box over here that you'll click, and now I can assign a different color to the ambient. Let me just change this to red, something like so. Now the first thing that you notice is, well, if you're applying an ambient color, wouldn't that you know, kind of look like it was glowing or maybe self-illuminated or something like that? And the answer is yes, it would. But with the standard material and using Scanline, in order to make that apparent, what you have to do is actually add some ambient light to the scene. To do that, what I'm going to do is hit the shortcut 8 to bring up my Environments and Effects tab. And under Global Lighting here, you'll notice that there's an ambient option. If I change that to, let's just say, a medium color, medium gray, you'll notice now that that material is actually showing this red ambient color. And if I was to give that a render, you can see you get that ambient, sort of like a global illumination. It's kind of a fake way to fake illumination, if you will, indirect illumination. Now, one quick note, let me hit 8 again to bring this up. Let me put this up to white. You notice what that does to the material editor here. All of my materials are now white. If you ever see that, that's linked to this ambient light. Sometimes when you import like an FBX file or an OBJ file, sometimes it'll actually change your ambient light color. That's an option on the importer to affect ambient. So if you import a file and all of a sudden all your materials look like this, come back here and check your Environment and Effects tab, this ambient color, and set that back to black, so that there's no ambient light in the scene. Also note, I don't recommend using this when you're using something like mental ray and global illumination, because it has the effect of, it's an even light source that's just cast throughout the entire scene, and it's good for, it may be good for like cartoony scenes or things like that, but if you're going for realism, that tends to wash out a scene really quick. So I would use that with caution. Definitely explore that option, but I just want to mention that use it with caution, because it can wash out details in your scene, especially things like bump maps. It plays havoc on bump maps, since that's just an effect anyway. Okay, so that's what that ambient feature is for. The diffuse, I've already talked about that. Specular, I've already talked about. Self-illumination does just what you think it would do. Makes this material appear self-illuminated. Now you can assign either a percentage or a color. So if I wanted it red to look like that, it kind of looks like a glowing, like it's illuminated, if you will. You can also assign maps to these, and as you can see, it's kind of a flat shade that you get with this. Now if you just set it for 100%. Going back to mental ray, you know, in mental ray you have some self-illuminated materials as well. Can you use these? Which should you use? Either like a mental ray self-illuminated material or a standard self-illuminated material. I would use the mental ray, the A and D self-illumination, because you have more options there. You can specify a strength, a Kelvin value, things like that. Whereas here you have a range of 0 to 100. Well, what is 100? How bright is 100? And in reality, that's a 0 to 1 scale. So in mental ray, especially when you're getting into work with daylight scenes and stuff like that, if you just applied one of these materials and set that to 100% self-illuminated, it probably wouldn't show up in the mental ray renderer, especially again if you're using like a daylight scene with the exposure control, photographic exposure control, just because it's still too dim to be recognized. You could go in and put like an output map here to boost that strength, something like so, and that would make this effect a little bit brighter. Let me close that down. But in reality, if you're using mental ray, you probably don't want to use these Scanline materials. You can, they have a translation, but when you think about it, when you're using a specific renderer, wouldn't you want to use materials and items that are designed specifically for that particular renderer? I don't want to have to wait for a translation of a standard material to go through to render in mental ray, when possibly I could just use the A&D material and it work a little bit better because it's specific to that renderer. So I generally try to keep these things separate. That's why I started out with on this discussion about materials with the Scanline renderer, because I'm trying to keep a distance between the two. Here shortly I'll switch over to the mental ray renderer and jump in to some more in-depth discussions on that. But that's, let me just cut that map out here. That's the self-illumination option, and it's that flat gray. It's linked to this color that I put in here. As you can see, as I change the color, that self-illumination changes as well. Opacity is just what you think it would, whether the material is opaque or transparent. Up top here in the shader basic parameters, you have a wire option where you can just render the wire cage instead of the actual shaded option or shaded mesh. If you wanted to change that, just a quick note, if you wanted to change the width of that wire, you can do so here in the extended parameters option. You'll see that there's an option for wire. If I decrease that down to 0, it doesn't show anything, but if I increase it, you can see it getting thicker here in this render preview, material preview window. Just put that back to 1. I'm not going to go in depth here on the advanced transparency options of the material because this is just a basic overview of the material options here. Here you have a super sampling. If you're using the Scanline renderer, right now it's defaulted to use the global settings for the sampling. So it's going to look here for your all of your settings. If I wanted to use local sampling, I could just disable that and assign whatever sampling I wanted to use here. And sampling is like anti-aliasing, which just means if you have an image with a lot of jagged edges, it's going to smooth out those edges at the cost of render time. As you increase your sampling for practically all renderers, Scanline, whatever, you're going to slow down or decrease your you're going to increase your render times because it has more calculations to do. Okay, I want to look at a couple of more of these Scanline type materials. Just go to another material slot. You have an advanced lighting override. Let me click that. I'm just going to tell it to discard old material. And basically you can use this material if you're still using radiosity. You can adjust the reflectance scale, adjust color bleed with this particular material. So you can't really, there's not a lot of settings here to adjust or to modify. You can just adjust the spinners here. If you wanted less reflectance or more reflectance, you can see the little symbols here, what that's going to do. You can adjust the amount of color bleed or the transmittance scale. That's for like subsurface scattering or something along those lines, where it's actually going through an object, this material. Now, one of the more commonly used materials here with the Scanline render would probably be this architectural material. If I click that up, this is similar to maybe the A&D material equivalent in mental ray. This architectural material here would be for the the Scanline renderer. You have templates that you can use. You have fabrics, glass. And if I just switch over to glass, you can see that creates a transparent glass material. You have a translucent type glass. You come down, you can pick up something like metal brushed. Here's a metal that's reflective. So if I can just drag that down to the object here, close that and give this a render. You can see it's similar to that ray traced material that we were using earlier, except it has this tighter specular, and you can adjust that with this shininess value. Like 100% is a really small specular, whereas zeros are a rather large specular. And just as with the other materials, you can assign your bitmaps here to things like the diffuse color, diffuse map, shininess map. You could set a luminance value, have this self-illuminated. You can assign a map to that. Let me just close this down. In the special effects rollout, you have a bump, displacement, intensity, and a cutout if you wanted to apply like a cutout map, which would be like a black and white map. Let me just put, let's say, a checker map in here. You can see how that's creating that cutout effect. You have other options up here. If I switch to something like paint gloss, and by doing that, you'll see that it keeps some of the settings here. It kept that checker map cutout. Let me get rid of that. It also kept the luminance value, but you have other options here that are enabled, and between the two materials, which in this case are just basically two colors, and that's why I end up with this kind of muted yellowy orange look here. Okay, so that's the blend material. Up next, you have a composite material. I'm just going to tell it to discard. With the composite material, you can let me close that. You can blend a couple of different materials here. You're going to start off with a base material, and what I'll do is just make this let's make this yellow. Now if I wanted to maybe put some reflections on this, and I didn't want to make this material reflective for whatever reason, what I could do is come in and maybe put a ray trace material here, and you can see what happened is that it's adding this material. You have these modes. You have additive, subtractive, and multiply, and a percentage amount. And if I set that to 0, you can see it's going to composite this in an additive mode on top of this base material. So if I come in here and let's say I want to make this reflective, like so. Now you can see I have this yellow reflective material. You can make it a subtractive mode if you wanted to, or multiply, which multiply and additive are kind of similar here. As I increase this, it becomes more of the this particular material. If I set it to 0, then it's pretty much just the base material. So if I just drop this onto the object and give that a render, so you can see now I have this yellow material that is reflective, but you know, obviously I don't have a reflective yellow material here. It's just a standard material. The reflections are coming from this ray trace material, and you can have, as you can see, you can have up to 9 of these different materials that it will composite on top of this base material. Okay, up next you have the DirectX shader, which I'll talk more about that in the mental ray material basics video. I have a double-sided material. Let me just click that and discard this material, just so that we can see the effect. Again, you have a facing material and a back material on this double-sided material option, and it's going to mix these two. So what I'm going to do is come in and just change the colors here again so that it becomes evident maybe what's going on here. Go back up to the double-sided settings. So what I'll do is just give this a quick render the way it is right now. Let me pause the video while this renders. Alright, there's the resulting render. Now if I come through and I increase the translucency value, it's going to mix between the facing and the back materials. And just set that to 50% mix. And if I render this, it's kind of hard to see what's going on here. You can kind of see the green coming through here in sections. Now I can make this a little more evident by, let's just go into the back material here and make this maybe self-illuminated just a little bit, something like 10%. Render this again. So as you can see here, you could actually mix together two different materials here to come up with kind of a fake translucency look here. If they were self-illuminated materials, or if one of them was, kind of a way to fake translucency. So that's kind of a neat option, a neat material to use there. Let's see, coming up next we have, that was double-sided, I have the ink and paint material, which I have a separate video on that, so I won't go into the ink and paint material. You have a matte shadow material, which catches shadows only. There's a similar material in Mental Ray, and so I'll wait and go over that with the Mental Ray renderer discussion on materials. You have a morpher material here. If you have some morphs in your scene, meaning, let's say, one thing that changes into another, you could use this material on that. I won't go into that. That's kind of a unique material. I'm not going to get into that right now. Another useful one that you'll probably use quite frequently is this multi-sub-object material. So I want to hit that just a second. Let me click this. Let me discard that material. This multi-sub-object material is kind of neat because you can set really any number of these that you want, and you can assign different materials to different material ID objects in your scenes. So for example, if I come through, let me just change the colors here. These are all standard materials that it defaults to, so I'm just going to go through here and change some of these colors. That looks good. Like so. That's probably good enough. If I look at this object here that this little test object that I'm using, I've used the shell modifier on that. So what I'm going to do is come in and put different material IDs on different aspects of this object. And when I do that, let me just change this one to 2. As you can see, it picks up the colors from these material IDs, the different materials that are assigned here. Like material ID 1 for this mesh is red, so it applies that red material. Blue is the inside, and green is the outside. So you can assign different materials with different properties. If I wanted that one shiny, for example, I could have that. If I wanted this to be sort of shiny, I could do that. So it's a really neat way of blending different materials or assigning different materials to objects in your scene. Again, you'll probably use this one quite frequently. I know I do, because it is rather handy. So the next we have the ray trace material, which I've already talked about. I have a shell material. Let me click that and discard the existing material here. And actually, I won't get into this one the more I think about it, because the shell material is basically for when you're doing texture baking, and that's kind of out of the range of this particular video. But what this is going to do is blend between an original material and the baked, after you've done your texture baking, the baked material. So that's the purpose. You'll use this shell material if you're doing any texture baking. Up next, I have a shellac material. The shellac material is a good one to use. I'll say that it's kind of a good material because it blends the two materials together here using a shellac, which, if you think of it, it's kind of like a clear coat. You would think that this would be good for like car paints or things like that, where maybe I have a this material here as the base layer of the paint. Maybe I want a kind of a yellow color specular, something like that. And then for the shellac material, I would put like a ray trace material. Maybe give this a fall off, a Fresnel fall off here. Make this 1.8, and once I start mixing this, you can see that it's adding that reflectivity here. The one of the drawbacks to this is that this is an additive mode, and you can actually go way up here, and this will actually create light in your scene, and it's not physically accurate. So be very careful when you're using this one, because you can get out of a physically correct material real quick. As you can see, my reflectance are both pegged out at 100% here, so not a really accurate material, especially once you go beyond 100 for that blend material here. But if I was just to give this a render right quick to see what that looks like. And there's the render. So again, this has a lot of potential. It can be useful, but just be careful that you don't get into a scenario with this where you're doing an incorrect, actually creating light in your scene because this material is too bright. It's over bright. So just be careful with it. Up next, let's see, we have the standard material, which I've already gone over. Probably the last one that I'll talk about here is this top and bottom material. Let me discard that. And I'll come in, and as you can see, there's two materials here. You have a top material and a bottom material. Let me just change the colors here so that we can see what's going on. Like so, and go back up to the top bottom material, give this a render. And as you can see, this is giving me a material on the top of this mesh and a material on the bottom, and it does that per if you notice, it's keeping track of my material IDs here as well. So for example, if I come through and I turn that shell modifier off, that's giving this thickness as well as the different material IDs, this object will just be an outside hull with a material ID of 2 all across it. So if I render that, you can see now we have that just on the outside here. So it does keep track of your material IDs as to how this is applied. And you have a blend option here. If I wanted to smooth that out, I could increase that blending. That gradient color would be smooth, and I could adjust the position here if need be. And you can use either the world coordinates or local coordinates, whichever coordinate system you needed to use for this particular object or the effect that you are after. Okay, so that is the top and bottom shader or material here. And beyond that, you have an XREF material. I won't get into that because it's obviously specific to XREF objects. If you were going to bring that in, you would have to assign the file name and object that it's going to be applied to. So with that, I'm going to bring this discussion to a close here on the material fundamentals, if you will, of the Scanline renderer. This was a high-level overview of the materials, and what I'll do is in the next section of this video, or in the next video, I'm going to focus on materials in Mental Ray, and I'll go more in depth there as far as these submaps as well as the materials, and break down the differences between materials, texture maps, and shaders, all of that good stuff. So with that, I'll bring this particular video to a close.